Hey guys, so I wanted to quickly review everything we went over in preparation for the final exam. So we're going to kind of be paying attention to our 5 kinetic chain checkpoints here. The foot and ankle complex, the knee joint, the lumbopelvic hip complex, shoulder complex, and cervical spine. I did break it down a little bit compared to that. You'll notice when we get down to like the lumbopelvic hip complex, I broke down the hip joint by itself, and then I broke down the lumbar spine by itself. We broke down the scapula by itself and the shoulder joint by itself. And then we got the elbow joint and the cervical spine there at the end. So we're going to quickly browse through all of these movements. And then the way that I broke all of this down is it has got like the movement, like the joint action, so ankle dorsiflexion, and then the primary muscles that are in charge of that. I also went ahead and underlined the primary movers for most of these motions. So these are the muscles that are mostly doing this job. You know, for instance, like when you get down here and you talk about like hip abduction, yeah, your TFL does assist a little bit in that, but the TFL is much more known for hip flexion and internal rotation of the hip joint. So because it's not really one of its primary actions, I didn't underline it. It's still listed there, but it's not going to be primary. So we're going to spend most of our time here talking about the primary actions of these movements in order to prep you for today's final. So first thing we are going to look at, we've got key movements associated with the foot and ankle complex. You'll also notice that I put a little bit of extra space in between things when they are separated. And you know what? I actually might even just put page breaks between these. It'll make this document seem much, much larger, but that'll kind of really break things up here. So when we're looking at the foot and ankle complex, the 2 primary things we're going to observe are going to be ankle dorsiflexion and ankle plantar flexion. Then the other movements we're going to observe are ankle inversion and ankle eversion, which is that frontal plane movement. So in the sagittal plane, you're going to see dorsiflexion. That's primarily going to be your anterior tibialis, and your peroneals are going to assist with that as well. We've got ankle plantar flexion. Plantar flexion, your primary movers here are going to be your gastrocnemius and your soleus. Posterior tibialis does help with that a little bit as well. Then we get into ankle inversion, which is that inward rotation. You're showing the bottom of your foot towards the midline. That's going to be your anterior tibialis and your posterior tibialis, so both your tibialis muscles. And then ankle eversion, which is showing the outside of your foot away from your midline. That's going to be your peroneals. Then if we're looking down at our knee joint here, we've got the 2 primary motions that we're probably thinking of, which is knee extension and knee flexion. Knee extension is that straightening movement when you're kicking your leg forward like a soccer ball. Knee flexion is when you're bending your heel towards your glutes. For knee extension, it's primarily going to be your rectus femoris, which is that really big quadriceps muscle that runs over top of everything else. It also acts as a hip flexor, so we're going to see that here in just a little bit. And then you've got your 3 vastus muscles, your vasti muscles. You've got your vastus lateralis on the outside, your vastus intermedius in between. I'm going to put that in between actually. And your vastus medialis oblique, which is going to be on the inside. So inside vastus muscle. So these 3 only perform knee extension, but your rectus femoris does knee extension as well as hip flexion, which we'll see in just a second when we get to the hip joint. So then we have got knee flexion. Those are going to be your 3 hamstring muscles, your semimembranosus and semitendinosus. Those are your medial hamstring muscles. And then you've got your biceps femoris. And your biceps femoris has 2 separate sets of fibers. It's got its long head fibers and its short head fibers. So the long head biceps femoris is going to assist, perform knee flexion, but it's also going to assist in hip extension. But your biceps femoris short head, since it only attaches at the knee joint, can only do the knee flexion. Now you've also got tibial rotation here as well. Tibial rotation, which is going to be either external or internal, is when you've got your knee bent and you rotate your foot towards the outside. That is going to be tibial external rotation. We'll actually put that here as well. We'll say knee or tibial internal rotation, or knee and tibial external rotation. So as we're looking at tibial internal rotation, that's going to be your medial hamstring, your semitendinosus, and your semimembranosus, right? That's the medial hamstring. But the tibial external rotation, that is going to be your biceps femoris, whether it's your long head or your short head, because that ties to the outside. They both do external rotation. So those are your key movements associated with the knee. Then if we are looking at the hip joint, right? So rather than talking about the entire pelvis, we are just going to look at the hip joint and how our femur moves around. You've got hip flexion, which is bringing your femur, anteriorly and superiorly. So you're swinging it forward, almost again like you're kind of, if you were like kicking a soccer ball with a straight leg, right? The main muscles here are going to be your rectus femoris, but also your psoas muscles. So you're going to see your iliopsoas here. Your iliopsoas is a combination of what we refer to as your psoas and your iliacus. One of the other main muscles here is going to be your tensor fascia latae, that TFL muscle that runs from your ASIS to the greater trochanter of your femur on the outside. That acts as a primary hip flexor as well. And then your sartorius, that really long muscle that runs from the outside of your hip and ties to the inside of your knee. All of those muscles on the front of the hip are going to allow you to drive your knees up or drive with a straight leg, kicking your leg forward. So that's your hip flexion. Then we've got hip extension. So we're thinking of like a squatting motion, right? If you were extending out of the bottom of the squat, your primary muscles here are going to be your gluteus maximus. That's really the main muscle that does hip extension. But then we've also got your biceps femoris, long head, medial hamstring, right? So that's going to be the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. So remember, your hamstring muscles do assist in hip extension, but they're really not the primary movers. The main muscle here is going to be your gluteus maximus. And then when we're looking at the biceps femoris, that lateral hamstring muscle, it's only the long head that can assist in hip extension. Your short head cannot. So that's flexion and extension. Then we move down to talking about abduction versus adduction. Hip abduction, your primary muscle here is really going to be that gluteus medius, right? Your glute medius is definitely the main abductor muscle here. Yeah, your TFL helps. Yeah, your glute min helps. Sartorius and the piriformis are there to assist as well, but they're really not primary movers there. The one we really want you to focus on is that gluteus medius. Hip adductor, so hip adduction, adding your hip muscle back, or your hip joint back to your midline. Obviously your adductor complex is going to be the main muscle here, muscle group here. So your adductor longus, which is the long one, the brevis, which is the short one, and then the magnus, which is that kind of webbing that covers both the anterior and posterior side. Yeah, your gracilis and pectineus are there as well, but mainly hip adduction is going to be the adductor complex. Then the last movement in the hip complex that we've got is internal versus external rotation. So we're looking at hip, or we could say like femoral internal rotation, right? Or we could say hip or femoral external rotation, right? So again, your adductor muscles are going to assist in this. Your glute minimus is a big one here, but honestly, I'd say the most important one, and I'll actually, just because it's most important, I'll go ahead and put this up top here. That's going to be your tensor fascia latae, that hip flexor muscle that also performs hip internal rotation. Yes, these muscles are here to help as well, but again, these are sort of your primary ones here. Then we've got external rotation, where your glutes are really going to be king here. Your gluteus maximus and your gluteus medius are both going to do that hip external rotation, which is why you'll hear trainers sometimes say like, hey, do a little bit of foot turnout and that'll activate your glutes more. That's because you'll be doing a little bit of hip external rotation. Then we've got the lumbar spine, of which you're going to see lumbar flexion, which is like a crunching motion, lumbar extension, which is like a back extension motion, lateral flexion, which is that like side to side motion, and then rotation, right? And particularly, we're just looking at the lumbar spine right now, so those lower vertebrae in the low back, right? So the main muscles for lumbar flexion are going to be your rectus abdominis, your abdominal muscles, right? And your external obliques do actually do a lot of flexion in addition to like the rotational. So I know we think of our obliques and we think of them as like rotators, and they are great at that, but they also do help bend our spine a little bit. Then you got lumbar extension. The real big one here is going to be your erector spinae. Yes, your multifidus helps with that as well. But primarily for spinal extension, we are looking at the erector spinae there. We've got lateral flexion, which is our side-to-side motion. That's going to be where your obliques come in, right? So your internal and external obliques are both going to be in charge of that. But then on the back side, with your low back, you've also got your quadratus lumborum, which is that big fat muscle that runs from like your lowest rib to the very top of your pelvis. That's your QL, or quadratus lumborum. We'll put that up here, actually, QL. Yeah, your abs can help, but really they're not that great at it. And then lumbar rotation, you're going to see the oblique muscles again, right? So you're going to see your external obliques, your internal obliques. They're really like your rotator muscles. And that's why, like, if you've ever done like wood chops or Russian twists, you know, you're really working on those obliques there. Again, these muscles are there to kind of assist, but they're not really like key movers in this action. So if you're only going to memorize one or two muscles, I'd focus on the obliques there when you're trying to understand rotation. Then we are moving to the upper body. We're going to move into the scapula first. So for right now, we're just going to kind of look at the shoulder girdle. We'll break down the shoulder joint after this. So with your scapula, you are going to have scapular protraction, which is that driving of the shoulder blades. I'm sorry, scapular protraction, which is the rounding of the shoulders forward, right? Scapular retraction, which is the pinching of the shoulder blades back. Now, you're also going to have scapular upward rotation and scapular downward rotation. So if you look from the side here, you can see if I round my shoulders forward, my shoulders are also kind of pointing down like this, right? Like my shoulder blades, if they sit like that flat and they start pointing downward, that's scapular downward rotation. We primarily want to focus on developing our clients scapular upward rotation so they can get those shoulder blades to sit back in a neutral position. So your scapular upward rotation, downward rotation are important things to pay attention to, not just the rounding. Then we've got scapular elevation and scapular depression. So let's go ahead and look at those muscles there. So for protraction, bringing the shoulder blades around the front of the body, your main muscles are going to be your serratus anterior and your pectoralis minor. Now, both of those perform protraction, but we're about to see the pec minor show up again in that downward rotation, which really, you know, sort of makes that pec minor kind of the bad guy here, because that's really responsible for two of the main, you know, postural distortions that we see in our clients. We see a lot of people have rounded shoulders by having protraction and downward rotation, and a lot of that's because of that pec minor. So that's a protractor. Then we got scapular retractors. The really big muscles here are going to be your middle trapezius and your rhomboids. They are going to pull your shoulders back. So if you're trying to address that, that's definitely something to focus on. Your scapular upward rotation, which is another one we want to focus on, right? Muscles that we want to strengthen, that's going to be your lower trapezius, right? Which makes sense because those are the ones tied on the very bottom of your scapula, so that's going to pull them backwards, and, you know, and get that tilted in the direction we want it to. But also you're going to see the serratus anterior, which was on our protraction list. But remember, your serratus anterior is tied to the bottom of your scapula. Your pec minor is tied to the top of your scapula. So if you think about like pulling from the top, that causes that downward rotation. If you think about pulling from the bottom, that causes upward rotation. So most of our clients have a lot of like downward rotation and not enough upward rotation. So the serratus anterior is going to be one of our good guys there. And then your middle trapezius does a little bit of as well, but nothing to really write home about. I just realized I just need a little more space between each of them. So then we've got scapular elevation and scapular depression. Scapular elevation is going to be performed by primarily your levator scapulae, which is literally like scapular elevation. So your levator scapula is going to be a big one there. And then your upper trapezius, right? That trap muscle running right along the side of your neck. That's going to be another one that's very overactive, causing that elevation. We're also going to need to do scapular depression, which your lower trapezius is primarily responsible for, right? That's going to pull your scapula back down. So that's a direct antagonist to your levator scapula list. Then we are going to see your shoulder joint. So now we're looking at that ball and socket. Sometimes your shoulder joint is called your glenohumeral joint. right? Because it's where your glenoid cavity sits with your humerus. So you've got shoulder flexion, you've got shoulder extension, shoulder abduction, and shoulder adduction, as well as internal and external rotation. So for shoulder flexion, the primary muscles here are going to be your anterior deltoid, right? That front deltoid muscle right here, as well as the top fibers of your pectoralis major. That's going to perform shoulder flexion. For shoulder extension, your prime mover here is going to be your latissimus dorsi. Not that your pecs, the lower fibers of your pecs so that your teres minor aren't helping, but really the key muscle here is going to be the lats. That's the one we want you to remember. Then we've got shoulder abduction, right, which is like raising your arms away. The main muscle there is going to be your medial deltoid. Then you get shoulder adduction. The main muscle there is going to be your lat. So you got this big lat muscle competing with this little tiny deltoid muscle there, which is why most of us tend to struggle with abduction. You'll see people like do it and they'll get to here and then they'll like tilt their body or they'll raise their shoulder up. So these tend to be a little bit underactive and these muscles tend to be a little bit overactive. Then you're going to see shoulder internal rotation. That internal rotation primarily is going to be your latissimus dorsi and your teres major, which is this big, larger of the two teres muscles that ties to the front of the humerus and therefore like rotates it inward, right? For shoulder external rotation, you're really going to want to focus on your rotator cuff, which is going to be made up of your teres minor, so that's a really important one, and your infraspinatus, just a little tiny itty-bitty muscle that runs inferior to the spine of the scapula and grabs the back of your humerus so that it can externally rotate it. Also your posterior deltoid, so if you had your anterior deltoid here, your posterior deltoid is going to be back here. That's another one. So you're going to focus on strengthening it by doing those external shoulder rotation movements. We're also going to see horizontal abduction, which is moving from a lateral to an anterior position, and horizontal abduction, which is moving from an anterior to a lateral position. So push-ups are an example of horizontal adduction. Rows are an example of horizontal abduction. The primary muscles for horizontal adduction are going to be your pectoralis major. That should come as no surprise if we're talking about push-ups, and the anterior deltoid as well. For horizontal abduction, your primary muscles are going to be your posterior deltoid and that teres minor. As well. Oh my gosh, it's not actually. Yeah, and that's the main muscles there, tying to your shoulder joints. Now, obviously, when we're talking about like rowing motions, we're probably also considering like scapular retraction, and so you're going to see the rhomboids and middle trapezius there, but they don't tie to the actual humerus, so therefore that's not necessarily horizontal abduction for those muscles, and that's why you might not see that there. So then we have got key muscles associated with your elbow joint, right? So primarily we're going to be talking about flexion extension in the sagittal plane, and then we'll be talking about pronation and supination in our transverse plane. So for elbow flexion, the really big one we want you to remember is that biceps brachii. Your brachialis and brachioradialis are actually really important as well. But generally, the first muscle you're going to think of when you think of the biceps is the biceps brachii. And for tricep extensions, you're going to think of, for elbow extension rather, tricep extensions, you're going to think of the triceps brachii there. So your biceps brachii and your brachialis and your brachioradialis it's kind of similar to your hamstrings in a way, right? They perform like elbow flexion instead of knee flexion. And then your triceps brachii are kind of similar to your quads. They perform elbow extension instead of like knee extension. Pronation and supination, which is that movement in the forearm there. Your brachioradialis is in charge of the pronation. So if you wanted to strengthen that portion of your biceps, you would actually do like something like a reverse curl. That'd be a great way to get your brachioradialis. But if you wanted to get your biceps brachii, you're going to want to perform that in supination. And again, that's the big meaty bicep muscle there. And then lastly, we got our cervical spine, right? So we're going to have cervical flexion, cervical extension, cervical lateral flexion, as well as cervical rotation here. Most of our clients tend to have way too much cervical flexion. So the overactive key muscle there is going to be your sternocleidomastoid, and your weak muscles there are going to be your erector spinae, your spinal extensors. For lateral flexion, you're also going to use the sternocleidomastoid. and your rectus spinae a little bit, as well as your upper traps are going to help with that a little bit. And then for cervical rotation, again, a primary muscle is that sternocleidomastoid, which you can see shows up in 3 different joint actions, which is why that darn muscle is so stubborn and loves to get overactive. The more actions a muscle has, sort of the more likely it is to become overactive. So that is your guys' review. Hope you found it helpful. Good luck on the final today. I will see all y'all tomorrow.